How often have you felt restricted to spiritual practices that often seem outdated and of little relevance in today's world? Are you discouraged to express your own creative talents and develop spiritual practices that are uniquely you? The Liturgical Rebels podcast is for people like you who want to reimagine and reconstruct their faith and spiritual practices. It's for those who want to reshape belief and journey closer to God's wholeness with peace, justice, and flourishing, not just for themselves, but for the earth and all its inhabitants. I am Christine Sine. In this 5th episode of the Liturgical Rebels, I am joined by co-host Lilly Lewin, worship curator from Nashville, Tennessee. Together we will be in conversation with Mark Pierson, worship curator and pastor of Rhythms of Grace Church in Auckland, New Zealand, and the man that both of us see as being responsible for making us into liturgical rebels. Mark founded Mainstage Music and Arts Festival, which became Festival One in New Zealand, and also curates worship for large events around the world. We will discuss the concept of worship curation and its impact on the way we approach church. Mark will share some incredible examples of curated worship experiences, as well as his latest initiative, T&B. The conversation also touches on the challenges faced in introducing creative elements to traditional church settings and the importance of curating people's gifts. I'm Christine Sine, host of Liturgical Rebels podcast, and I am in conversation with my co-host, Lilly Lewin, and my guest from New Zealand, Mark Pierson. And we were just commenting before this that we are liturgical rebels from all over the place, and that we are all over the place because Lilly is in Nashville, I am in Seattle, and Mark is in Auckland, New Zealand. So I think this should be a really fun conversation. So why don't we start, Lilly, why don't you just say a couple of words about who you are so that they can identify your voice
great.
too.
Lilly Lewin, and I'm actually a native Nashvilleian, which is hard to say now because lots of people have moved here over the years, but I grew up here, I lived all over the place, lived in California, Ohio, and in Seattle. So I'm a worship curator and I create sacred spaces for a living. So I help people engage God with all their senses. And my tagline on airplanes is I make church less boring.
I like that very much. And Mark, you describe yourself as a garden variety pastor, but you are not quite like any other pastor that I know. And I think that you were actually the one who coined the term worship curator to describe what you do. And you create art and do art installations at your church, Rhythms of Grace in Auckland, as well as in other places as well. So can you tell us a little bit about what it means to be a worship curator, how it got started, and how it impacts the way you do church?
Thank you, Christine, and hi to you and to Lilly. Yes, it's a short answer. The longer answer is I have a working definition of worship curator. But before I come to that, the worship curator concept really was came out of a reaction against worship leaders, or the term worship leader being used only to describe those who led sung worship. So I'm a worship leader at my church. Oh, the conversation would stop right there because it was only ever about leading the singing part of the worship. So they didn't actually lead worship, they led an element of worship. So the book that I wrote was The Art of Curating Worship. I can't even remember the subtitle, something about transforming the role of worship leader. So that people would identify with what that meant. So my working definition of worship curator, and this is this is language that I'm actually reading off the wall in my study at the moment, is that I curate contexts, bespoke, ephemeral, structured, and ambient spaces that are built around practices that offer people the potential for liminal moments of individual and corporate transformational engagement with the Trinitarian community of God that will sustain deeper human flourishing. Now, that started out as about half that length 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but it's grown to include everything that I kind of think's important these days. So basically, it's a way of looking at worship, the form of worship, the shape of worship, and seeing that as an art form to be worked with rather than a kind of scientific list of things that you should and shouldn't do. So, yeah, and that means blank sheet of paper, basically, for me.
Can you give us an idea of what that can look like in your church?
A curated worship, I mean, it can look exactly like anyone else's or any other worship in any other context, really, because I think it's about the subtleties that make worship different. If I were to describe in words, what the shape of a Sunday morning or last Sunday morning at Rhythms of Grace Church that I'm part of in Auckland was, then there'll be a whole lot of other people would say, oh, yeah, that sounds just like our church on a Sunday. But in fact, the reality is quite different, because I think it is about the subtleties and about the attitudes that we bring to it, about being willing to be open-ended in what we do and what we expect back from people. It's about building a relationship of trust with the congregation so that literally anything goes, and the but's important, isn't it? Sometimes but negates everything that's gone before it. In this case, the but is just saying, while anything goes, the context is really important. And the context is the people, primarily. And I know my congregation, 99% of them, pretty well. The 1% is the visitors who might be there on the day. And so I know where they're coming from. Excuse me. I know something of their life experience, a bit of their history, what's going on for them. So that context, that group of people is who I'm curating when I'm the curator, worship for. So that means that, after 7 or 8 years of doing that with this particular group of people, that it really is anything goes within that context.
Mm.
They're also a very generous group of people, so they put up with a lot from me. And that might be everything from standing up in this preaching slot and saying that I don't have anything to say to you this morning. So we're going to do Lectio Divina, or we're just going to go straight on to the station's response, through to how the worship event is shaped. We have quite a liturgical outline. If I was to write it down, it would be very ordinary things. Prelude and gathering prayers. So any other number of churches might have a very similar kind of, except the prelude can be anything. It might be 16th century monastic chanting, or it might be Florence and the Machine. Whatever is kind of the curator, I as curator decide will be best in that setting. We have our gathering prayers include breathing prayer, the oldest form of spiritual practice. We have breathing prayer pretty much every week. We would play bird song as part of our prelude often, because bird song, the dawn chorus, is known to go straight to the part of a person's brain that says this is a safe place, it's safety to be here. So we use a lot of New Zealand bird song. So then each of those elements, even though they're described, lament, prayer, confession, prayers for others, word, which is read in the scripture, words, which is a provocation, responding to the words, those kind of things, they're standard in any service. Even a non-liturgical church would have those, even if they weren't able to name them. But because anything goes in each of those slots, whether I as curator are leading them or someone else in the congregation is. You get a massive amount of creativity and variety going on through the whole service. So for someone who likes words, then there's something for them to latch onto. For someone who loves images, or that's the primary way they engage with God, or their primary intelligence or way of learning, there's something, the whole variety in each service and over time. So I don't know if that's clear or not, but that's what curating worship means to me. I should just say we have communion every week, and a response time following the communion. Sorry, a response time including the communion. So you can come and share communion, and there are 3 or 4 standard stations, like a prayer net, where you can read other people's prayers and make them your own, where you can add your prayers to it. The communion to go to, and candle lighting would be our standard 3 stations. And during Lent, we've added about 4 other stations to that each Sunday, different kinds of ways of responding to the themes of Lent. And other times, depending on the preacher or speaker or what part of the church year we were in, we would have other stations in there as well. So that's what curating worship looks like to me.
And one of my favorite things, so I met Mark in 2004. I knew about Mark before that. And so in 2004, I went to the Greenbelt Arts Festival in the UK, but I used that as an excuse to go hear Mark do a workshop in Oxford. And he said a few minutes ago that Pete Ward was the one who organized that, but it was several people that you know, Christine, who were there, like Karen Ward and Johnny Baker. And I was homeschooling our youngest son, Hudson, at the time, so he got to come as well. But Mark is one of those people that gives permission. And before I knew him in person, and as a friend over now 20 years, which is crazy, he was the first person I ever heard say, oh, what if you gave away the different pieces of a worship service so that somebody else could do the prayer, or somebody else could do the sermon, or somebody else could do a poem. And I felt like that was so freeing to say, oh, it wasn't just about him as the pastor, but it was giving permission to everybody else in the worship service to be creative and to actually participate. And I think that's one of the gifts that Mark has given to the church, at least to me. And not only did he give me worship curator as a concept of how I live, but also, permission to be creative and to give people participatory permission within a worship gathering.
Thank you, Lily.
Well, and Mark, going on with that, my first introduction to you was the Stations of the Cross that you used to do way back in the early 90s at your church. And it had a profound effect on me. I mean, and I know that it's not the only one of these big events that was in your church, but you've done a lot of big events, the Curating Worship for big events. And I was wondering how that came about. I know one time you brought something like 40 tons of sand into a warehouse as the basis for the worship experience that you were doing. And I wondered how this came about. And, kind of what some of these art installations have looked like that have, that you've done all over the place.
Thank you for that question. That's what I just love, those installations. I should say that the church I'm part of and have been for 8 years has never grown to a regular size of more than 50. We're about 40 or 50 now. So I'm part of a small church, not a large church. But going to a festival or something like that gives you a bigger budget and a bigger audience over an extended period of time. So it's hard to justify 30 tons of sand and 30,000 litres of water for a Sunday morning, let alone the time it might take to get them together. But when you're at a 3-day festival with a massive space, it's about, 150 feet square, and the ceiling is about 30 feet high, and it's all black. There's no windows in it, but it is carpeted, fully carpeted. So putting 30 tons of sand, 30,000 litres of water into a space like that has just the right amount of challenge to it. But yeah, I go through my periods like artists do. You know, I have my sand period and my time of focusing on grass, live grass, large areas of it in the worship space, and water. So, do you want to know about that one in particular?
Yeah, why don't you describe one of the events that you've done at least?
Okay, the big event that was at Festival 1 in New Zealand, this very large conference venue on a massive farm site with all sorts of other buildings, one big building. So the intention was to create a precinct. I called them each year a precinct. So this was the precinct, the Hope Precinct, this particular year. So in it were going to be reflective stations and seminars, so a bit of music. We had jazz, live jazz, and a communion event, and a few other things like that happening, and also had to house about 25 missions booths, which are the bane of my life mostly, because you end up with a very creative space, and then mission organisations who've got no idea how to engage anyone other than with text on big banners or big sheets of plywood or something. I think that bigger text is being creative instead of having smaller text. So it's big venues, and I'd done various other things in it. We'd built one year we'd built a huge Noah's Ark out of scaffolding and done a whole lot of art activities around that. So this year we just trucked in 30 tons of sand onto the carpet with polythene underneath it, black plastic, 30,000 litres of water that we built a pond and a 12-foot high waterfall with. But there were mission organisations around the outside, built entrance ways. I don't like people to be able to see the space immediately, even on a Sunday morning. If we're doing something special. So I built this Z-shaped corridors that went into the space, and they took 1,200 coffee sacks. They were about 6 metres high. So the entrances are really important to me. I love building different entrances, even into church, the church space. And then in that happened there were a whole lot of stations that were just there for the whole weekend. We brought Ted Liddon-Hatton down from Iowa to do some sand drawings and things like that, because we had plenty of sand. We marked a labyrinth in the sand. We built a large burning bush out of steel and pumice, so methylated spirits. And then there were art activities. It was about building, stone, whatever you call those things in the Old Testament, piles of stones. What's a pile of stones called?
A can.
Yeah, thank you. Cans, and people painting on stones and building it. Yeah, so that was the 3 days. It was a lot of fun.
What kind of response did you get?
Yeah, the responses almost always, and the responses to that, let's stay with that, were just incredibly moving. Perhaps from my perspective as a designer and conceptual person and the one who led the build, at 3:00 in the morning before it opened the first day, there were a group of about 8 serious crew leaders around the site who came and just looking over the site, and they came and stood there in absolute silence and never spoke, never said anything at all, and then moved away in silence. And that still gives me goosebumps thinking about it right now. These people who know what the build took, they know what went into that, and they sense God's presence enough to keep them quiet. Maybe they were just really tired in that space. But other than that, there's always opportunity for people to respond and to say how they found the space, what God might have been saying to them, or to frame it in their own words, to make marks, to draw, to write. It's humbling, really. Like even what Lilly talked about, 20 years ago. I just do what I do, I have no idea. He put it out there, and God makes it significant sometimes for some people. It's a great honour.
Well, and we're all sitting here drinking our cups of tea. One of the reasons being, Mark, that we know that you love tea And at the last few years, you have developed something called T and B. And you have developed rituals to be used in church, in events. And I know you've even in the last year or so built a tea house in your backyard. So can you tell us a little bit about this initiative?
Yes, I can. I love to talk about tea, and I love to do tea rituals with people or tea sessions. So I have not attempted to duplicate Chinese tea ritual or Japanese tea ritual. I just do, I call them sessions rather than rituals, although they draw from other tea rituals. So 5 years ago, 6 years ago, maybe now, I've no idea where the idea came from. Just from God, I would say, out of nowhere. This thought, let's have tea at this big festival. So it's the same festival I did the Hope Precinct at. So T and B, let's have a cup of tea together and be together. So I designed 45-minute sessions on the hour. I built a table that seated 14 people and some other stuff around it. And people came, they signed up on sign-up sheets to say when they wanted to come because it was limited to 14 people. The week before, I'm lying in bed awake as I usually do before these events thinking, this is one of the dumbest ideas you've ever had. Who, out of the people coming to this festival, mostly teenagers, young adults, is going to come and sit and have a cup of tea while you talk about the history of tea and things? And the next day I had two people email me, two different people who said, oh, we've heard that there's going to be tea ceremonies at Festival 1. We'd like to book in now to make sure we don't miss out. So, and again, I can feel the emotion of that. Sitting still 8 years later, that was just God saying, yeah, maybe there's something in here. So 45-minute sessions, 15 to 20 minutes of the introduction to tea, the history of tea, how to drink tea properly, how not to drink it, what tea is, what tea isn't, and then a selection of 4 or 5 teas on a placemat where you can choose your tea that you want to have, and then being served those teas by a couple of T&B crew. And then the B part of that was just to be present to yourself, be present to God, be present to others around you at the table, be present to the tea. And within, I don't know, the first 18 or 24 hours, the first day, it was fully signed up for the whole weekend. And so I just started doing them other places. People would ask me to go to their church. We designed our church services. We have all our church meetings around TMB sessions, done them all over the world. I'm on Lily's Lounge. Just served 1,000 cups of tea in a couple of months in Poland and New York City.
Wow.
and Glasgow when I was on sabbatical. Just trying to inviting people to be still, to be present. What people loved about them at the festival was that it didn't matter how noisy it was around them. This was a still and quieter place to be. You could supposed to only sign up with 2 people you didn't know, a maximum of 3. So that meant the 14 at the table were mixed up a bit. I've developed now a T&B communion service, which uses a liturgy we have at Rhythms of the Grace Church as the liturgy. But it's about making the tea together. So when I do that with people, I send them the tea in advance. So we make the tea and we talk about the history of the tea and the scent of the tea and the flavour and those kinds of things. And that's part of the ritual of T&B communion. So it's not just about having communion, but having tea, is a bit trendy, a bit hipster kind of. Well, I'm a bit old to be a hipster. But so that's what I love doing at the moment. And finished building my tea house that I've been using it for 18 months. People have been having tea in it. And I have a lot of pastoral conversations in it. I invite people, instead of meeting at a cafe, we meet in the tea house.
Lovely.
It's spectacular. The pictures I saw were spectacular. It just makes you want to go visit and have tea there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's built out of junk, recycled junk, built without any plans. I'm not a great planner. Just built it to fit a little space in my backyard.
Lily, I'm a little jealous that you got to be the recipient of one of these tea ceremonies. Can you tell us a bit about what it was like to be involved in this in Nashville?
Well, I think the gift is that our house church Thin Place meets around a table. And so, and at that point in time, we had lots of generations. So we had kids as well, not little kids, but we had kids as well as adults present. And so everybody got to participate and choose their teas. And everybody was present, very present. That's what I remember about everybody being very focused and present and excited about, learning more about tea that we didn't know hardly anything about. And my friend Linda Sines, who is a part of Rhythms of Grace, who lives in Chattanooga, was a part of it as well. But it was just a great gathering of people. And some of us knew each other really well, and some people were new to the group. And yet the tea brought us all together, and we were being together, not just, it's really the being part is as special as the tea part.
It is.
Lovely. Lovely.
Nice to see.
Mark, I know that the kinds of things you do haven't always been greeted with wide open arms from those around us. Can you tell us a little about the challenges you've faced in doing art installations?
The problem really is that there's too many dickheads in the church, people who not only have their own opinions, but think that their particular slanted opinion should be held by others and that everyone should conform to their dickheadery. I'm old now, and I've been doing this for 40 years in one form or another, at least 30 of those 40 years of pastoral ministry. So I don't care a whole lot, except I really do. It still really bugs me when someone is hypercritical, even if they're wrong, and it takes 50 positive comments to overcome that one. That's why I love my Sunday morning community so much, because, as I said, we trust each other, we know each other, and they will go anywhere. And they're at Rhythms of Grace because I've had enough of what their previous church worship in particular was offering them, or their church pastor. So I don't know, when we did the Stations of the Cross, we always had people who would criticize it. Mostly, inevitably, it was people who hadn't been there.
Of course, yes.
Stations of the Cross was Catholic, was Roman Catholic.
Yes.
And how could, evangelical church, Baptist church, do anything that was Catholic? And so I would just thank people for their comments and not try to justify it or go anywhere. The only time we dealt with it at depth was when the complaints came from within the congregation, when two people spoke to me about the offence that they felt one of the stations in the Stations of the Cross had caused. And you can edit this out or not, but it was a station that had Jesus saying, "I'm so fucking tired." And that offended a couple of people, which was fair. Well, that offended a couple of people. So we had a conversation at a church one Sunday morning, just talked for as long as it took, where the person who was offended shared why they'd been offended by it, and the artist talked about why they had chosen that language. And it wasn't to come to any decision or any conclusion. It was just for people to hear the other side, to hear what was going on. And interestingly, I think that was self-censoring for the next few years of Stations of the Cross. In some ways, we lost our edge a bit, I think. Everything became a bit safer just from having that conversation, which was fine. But that was really worthwhile to have. I don't get much criticism to my face these days. People used to, when we started Cityside Church, which was a church I was part of before Rhythms of Grace, we used to have time in the service on a Sunday morning when people would talk about what they had heard about us, what people outside were saying about us, and it was said that we sacrificed cats in worship. I don't have a lot of time for cats personally, but just bizarre stuff. And the most important thing to a lot of people was that we had taken the pews out of the church and we sat on couches and cushions, as if no one was interested in our theology. Were we Christ-centered church? Or I won't say no one was interested. These critics weren't interested in that. It was just the trimmings. So yeah. It's out of all of
Mm-hmm.
that the curator model for worship grew.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because, Lily, you do a lot of art curation at events. What kind of responses do you get to what you do?
Well, I think the people are hungry. I mean, I'm like Mark's been doing it longer than I have, but I've been doing it for 20 years. And when we first started, people would think, oh, it's new age or it's weird, or you'd have to justify why you were doing it. And now people are hungry. And it's like we need to reimagine again. It's because there's a whole generation of people that are really sick of regular church, whatever flavor it is, because it's still all talking at you. And I'm pretty frustrated that we still are talking at people. And because of things like podcasts, now you can get the best sermon in the world just from your phone or from your computer, but you can't get an experience with God. So the ways and the spaces that Mark creates and that I try to create are places where you can engage God versus someone telling you what you should know or think. That the Holy Spirit becomes the teacher and not just the person up front behind the podium or with the microphone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's I mean, it's interesting to me. One of the things I've noticed is that people are really wanting more creativity these days, not necessarily within the church, but within the way that they interact with God. And of course, you see a lot of that in kind of the kinds of things that you do, Lily, where they do Stations of the Cross and other kinds of experiential things at events, and the kinds of things that Mark does, big events. But also you see it on places like Instagram. I think that's the place that I see the most creativity in terms of what people are drawn to, in terms of expressing their relationship with God. Now, I'm not on TikTok, so maybe there's the same kind of creativity there. But, I don't know whether either of you have a comment about that in terms of, do you think that people are more open to creativity? Maybe I should ask Mark, since you're the one.
I think people have always been more open to creativity than the church has ever allowed them.
I'd say amen to that.
To be. And one of the things we need to be aware of is that we're actually not primarily talking about creativity. And we're definitely not talking about creativity for creativity's sake, or creativity to show that I'm smarter or more creative than someone else. And I think this is one of the major problems the church has suffered from, and that it doesn't really know why it exists. And out of curating worship, I tried to come down to that basic level, because once you know, or once you've decided what you exist for, and in my case, Rhythms of Grace exists to sustain people in their following of Christ in the world. It's as simple as that. And after that, anything goes, except the caveat I started out with. You have to know the culture of your community and the people in your community. Yes. But then when you do creative things, it's about how can I form these people after Christ. And that's where the creativity comes from. It's not, I want to be creative, so what can I do? What can I inflict on these people? And inevitably, when I lead seminars anywhere, always the question is asked, what do I do? And it comes out of a statement of, I couldn't do that in my church. Well, yes, you actually could, if you follow these steps, perhaps. So it's not about dumping everything on everyone all at one point. Creativity is a bit of a two-edged sword, I think. So even the 30 tons of sand, comes out of wanting to provide a setting in which people can engage with God through these stations that we're providing. And that's just the environment, the shell around it. Instead of having a church with pews in it, or a church with no pews in it, or being outdoors or whatever, it's about creating the space around it. So I think creativity is a two-edged sword, and we need to be very careful that we're keeping our people, the people we're responsible for, first and foremost. And I say that out of not always doing that when I started out, having a great idea that I just would not let go of it. I had to inflict on people because out of my own needs, rather than pastoral need.
Would you say, Mark, that I talk a lot about curating people's gifts? Do you work with that at Rhythms of Grace? Or, what I love what you said about knowing your congregation, because if you know the people in your community, then you know what they need and you know what they're good at, and like you said before, you have a trust between you and them. And so do you curate their gifts as well? Like, if you know somebody's a poet, you use them in that way, or has that come about just naturally?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. So that would work in two ways for me in my curating with Rhythms of Grace week by week. One is that I would provide a variety of media, I suppose you could call it, forms through the worship event, which might be reading a poem or having a video of a poem being read, if we're just talking about the poets. And then in the second level of that would be that the station might include the opportunity to write. In fact, there's always a station available for people to write. And sometimes that might be quite specific. Write a lament. Here's a format for a lament. Write your own lament. Or it might be, I wouldn't generally ask people to write a poem because most people wouldn't think they could. But I would include that in, just the same as I would say, I would no longer say write your response. I'd say write, draw, make marks as your response.
That's great.
Then I might make, if you're able to, put this in, make this into a poem, or might even offer a shape for people to do that in. So that will be part of the station's response, or something that happens from the front.
That's great.
That's great. Well, Mark, what else would you like to share with us? This is fascinating discussion. I'm sure that there are lots of things we haven't covered. But what else would you really like to share with the listeners?
I would like to say to those who have given up on going to church that I understand that. Mm-hmm. And I don't think you should feel bad about that. If you can't find somewhere that you feel safe in, where you can explore your relationship with God and what spirituality means for you today, then I'd encourage you to try to find one or two other people that you might do that with. And then you can do whatever you like. You can be as creative as you want. For me personally, I would always encourage people who do that to center that around communion, around the breaking of bread, and the words we use, I always use at communion, are Jesus took what they were eating and Jesus took what they were drinking. So if I didn't do that, I would have to say Jesus took the port that was there for those who like a drop of alcohol, and the water was there for those who are allergic to grapes, and the grape juice was there for those who didn't know any better, and go through the list of them. But I just say what they were drinking and what they were eating, and then you can have whatever you like in that, because there's nothing magical or even theologically sound about any particular form of drink or food. So I think that to gather around that and to have some words around that, and then to build out from there is enough. And above all, don't try to copy any service that you have from your past and just put it in a new form, but just gather together, share communion elements together, read the scriptures around that, add a scripture in if you want to, talk together about it, and keep it simple. And maybe you'll find other people who want to join you, or you find others that you want to join. So, and my very final comment would be that all of my comments come out of week by week pastoral leadership and curating worship with a small group of people, as small as 15 or 20 often. So this stuff can happen at a very minimal level.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, lastly, Mark, if people want to get in contact with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I'm still an emailer. Email is the best way.
We will put that in the show notes because you don't have a website, I know. I mean,
I do have a
specific.
website.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, I do. I don't think I've posted to it in the last year. That's all. I find WordPress just so too difficult to use.
I think that that's a truth about people like Mark and myself who are artists, is that we're too busy creating new things that we don't, and the tech thing is not our first strength, so we don't. It just sits there a little while.
Yeah.
That's fine. I mean, email's fine. We'll make sure that people know how they can get in touch with you if they want to get in touch with you. I think that is important because you are both creative and also you were able to help others draw out their creativity and the creativity of those in their congregation or small groups or events or whatever it is that they're gathering with.
Well, I think what Mark
is very important.
I think the beauty of what Mark does is it can be done in any size. I mean, that's the beauty of what he's taught me, is that it can be in a small group around your coffee table or your dining room table, or it can be something on a huge scale like a festival. So that's the brilliant thing about it.
Yeah. I agree. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for this conversation. And Lily, I think I'm going to be talking to you on your own in our next episode, and I look forward to that as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Mark.
I am Christine Sine. In this 5th episode of the Liturgical Rebels, I am joined by co-host Lilly Lewin, worship curator from Nashville, Tennessee. Together we will be in conversation with Mark Pierson, worship curator and pastor of Rhythms of Grace Church in Auckland, New Zealand, and the man that both of us see as being responsible for making us into liturgical rebels. Mark founded Mainstage Music and Arts Festival, which became Festival One in New Zealand, and also curates worship for large events around the world. We will discuss the concept of worship curation and its impact on the way we approach church. Mark will share some incredible examples of curated worship experiences, as well as his latest initiative, T&B. The conversation also touches on the challenges faced in introducing creative elements to traditional church settings and the importance of curating people's gifts.